Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to Iron Anchor Cycles. So the last video we did was about doing front suspension on a bagger, and today we're gonna keep with the same theme but change it up a little bit, and we're gonna do rear suspension on a Softail. So this is a product that we've installed I don't know how many times. It's definitely my favorite current shock available for the M8 Softails. We've tried a couple of other ones. There's been some changes in what's available in maybe the last couple of years since maybe the last time we did a video on one of these. So I thought maybe we would do it again, show you how it goes on. And also in this particular case, the install is a little bit different than it is on the other bikes. We'll get to that in a little bit later. But really what I wanted to do is just show you kind of the basics of the install, talk a little bit about this shock and why we like it. So one of the major things about these M8 Softails is that the design of the bike is really incredibly well done. So even with very subpar suspension components like the Monoshock that comes from the factory and the front end that's more or less the same as what's been on Harleys for a very long time, these bikes still ride and handle incredibly well, and that's a testament to the engineering that goes into how the rest of the bike is designed, that it can still handle and ride well, even with budget suspension components. So when you upgrade those suspension components, you're gonna get a lot of benefit out of it. So obviously, the big thing with these shocks is people want two things out of them. One is better handling, a better ride, and number two is usually additional height. So we'll take a look at where the stock height of this bike is, and we'll pick a measurement just to give you a reference of how much higher up the bike is gonna sit, and you can judge for yourself. And while we're talking about that, that's actually one of the reasons why I like this shock as much as I do, because it is maybe the tallest, or if not the tallest, a very tall option in terms of replacing these. So Öhlins was doing a couple different versions of their Monoshock that had an adjustable eyelet on it that you could get a little bit more height out of, still not quite as tall as this one. They've stopped doing that, so their new Monoshocks are not height adjustable. That had to do with some engineering changes on their end, so you lose even a little bit more of that additional height that you might have been able to get, whereas this shock is still gonna give you all that extra ground clearance. So that's a big one. Ride quality, it's hard for me to describe that to you, but suffice it to say, I run one on my bike. We've installed a lot of them. I really love it. They're adjustable both in terms of preload and also rebound, and you can really dial in both that sag to get it set the right way, of course, and then also the preload adjustment, which is external, and we'll see that, so you can make those adjustments on the fly as you need to change the dynamics of how the bike handles based on what you're doing. So you can get yourself a more aggressive ride, which would be for, let's say, not just cruising down the highway, but going and doing the twisties or the canyons or whatever. Or you can back that rebound adjuster off, give yourself a more plush ride, which would be, say, I don't know, riding to Sturgis or something like that, where you're doing a whole lot of highway miles and the aggressive riding maneuverability, that sort of thing, isn't maybe quite as important as just having a softer is a complicated word, but a more plush ride, which is what you'd achieve by doing that with the rebound adjuster. So lots of adjustment. It's really great all the way around. I think that's enough kind of talking about this, but we'll take a look at what's in the box when we start to install it, but I'm just gonna get into it. Let's get going on installing this. So we're gonna go ahead, and we got the seat off here already. I'm gonna get the bike jacked up, but that reminds me, before I do that, let's grab the tape measure here. And I'm just gonna measure from, again, sort of an arbitrary point. There's one of the flats on the axle nut is pointed horizontally, so I'm just gonna put the tape measure down on that. And right from this point to the bottom of the rear fender, it's about 10.5 inches. I could measure to another point, it doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to find a nice round number that we'll remember. So 10.5 inches from the top of the axle nut to the bottom edge of the rear fender. So keep that in mind, and when we get this changed, we will see what the difference is. So we're definitely gonna see some tire, hopefully some fender gap there too. We'll see what happens, but in any event, like I said, let's get going. So I'm gonna get the bike jacked up, we'll reposition the camera, and we'll start to get this old shock out and get prepped for the installation of the new shock, so stick around. All right, so we're ready to go and get started on the disassembly here. So what I've done is, in addition to obviously repositioning the camera, is I've got the center jack picked up under the bike, and we've got all of the weight taken off the rear tire. You're not gonna be able to see it spin under there, but you'll have to take my word for it, I guess. The next thing we're gonna do is start to, well, I guess disassemble and get the shock out of here. So first step here is gonna be to get this cross brace out. So we've got a couple of things to do here. One is we've got a wiring harness here that we need to just unclip from the bracket. So we got that taken off. And then we've got a couple of fasteners here to remove. We've got one small screw on this side. Got that. And then we've got the two larger bolts, one on each side. So on other bikes, we'll start to talk about some of the differences here on the Street Bob. Most of the other bikes, you can get at these fasteners pretty easy with just a 7/16 socket, but they do have a little Allen hole in the top of them as well. I'll show that to you, which with this longer wrench here, we can get in with the side covers still there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take this one out. All right, and so if you can see there what I was talking about, you've got a hex on the outside, you got a hex on the inside. So with just a long hex hex bit, you can get in there and get those. The wrench, at least the one I was using, wasn't gonna clear the struts here. Okay, second one. And now that cross member is free to come out. So we'll put that aside. And now we've got access to our shock here. So there's some other wires and stuff kind of shoved in here. This is something the customer did. I'm not sure what this is for, but we're just gonna ignore that for the time being. Hopefully it's not too much in our way. It looks like it's wrapped around the neck of the shock here. Maybe I can find a better way to route that. But in any event, our next step is gonna be to start to undo the bottom and top fasteners. So probably will reposition the camera again so you can see a little bit better. But before I do that, I'm gonna talk a little bit about something else that we're gonna have to do up here. And that is a little bit of trimming on this fender. Now, on the other Softail models, the fender is a little bit different and there's more clearance here, and the shock will just go in and you don't have to do any kind of modification. However, on these M8 Street Bobs, and I'm gonna assume that the Softail standard is the same, although I don't know because I haven't looked, the fender needs to be clearanced. And so what's gonna happen here is on the top of the shock body, there's gonna be a little 90-degree fitting, and then your reservoir line is gonna come out this way and run down the side of the swing arm. The fender needs to be clearanced right here to allow room for that stainless line. And that will become more obvious once we get this out and I show you the other shock, but I figured as long as we're here, I can show you this section here is what's gonna need to be trimmed. Now, obviously, this is not a visible part, so it's not as critical to have it be perfectly clean as you would if, let's say, it was on the outside of the fender, like if you were trimming the back of it. But we're obviously gonna do our best to make a really nice cut and try and make it look as clean as possible. And of course, we're gonna throw some paint on that raw metal as well so that we don't get any rust happening on this fender. So we'll make it look as good as we possibly can, and certainly we're gonna make it functional. So that's the name of the game anyway. So that said, I'm gonna reposition here and we'll start with getting the bottom fasteners removed, and then we'll move up to the top. All right, so I'm gonna make a little bit of a left turn here. I know I said I was gonna come over here and start to undo these bottom fasteners, but the more I think about it, the way that's gonna make the most sense to do this is actually just to go ahead and remove the entire fender assembly off the bike. Now, you go back and look at some of the previous videos we've done where we've done the shock installs, you don't need to remove the rear fender in most cases to get this pinch bolt undone, and you'll see the pinch bolt I'm talking about once the fender is off. It'll be much more visible and I'll point it out. I am certain I could figure out a way to get in there with a wrench and get that pinch bolt loosened up with this fender on, but given how easy these rear fender sections with the struts come off the bike, I'm just gonna take it off. And beyond that, while I certainly could do the trimming on this fender with it on the bike, it'll certainly make less of a mess if I do it off the bike, and it'll make things a little bit easier. So I'm gonna make two jobs a little bit easier by adding one additional step of taking this off. So what I've done is the wiring harness that we removed, the connector from that cross member, that's here, and we just have to unplug the connections for your turn signals and for, I guess, what would be a tail light, but in this case, it's just a license plate light on this bike. So you got the 3 harnesses here. Now we can just undo the 2 bolts on each side, and this whole thing is gonna come off, and we'll have all the room in the world to be able to work on the shock, and we can do the fender off the bike and then put it all back together. So that's what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started taking this off. Okay, so with the 4 bolts removed, this should just slide right back and off. There we go. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm gonna go put this down and we'll take another look back at the shock here. Okay, so this is the pinch bolt that I was talking about right here, that obviously you need to get in here with a wrench and loosen this up so that you can take the bigger bolt out here to free up the shock. Clearly, with the fender out of the way, you've got an infinite amount of space here, and you can use whatever shape or size tool you want to use to get this off. So I'm gonna go ahead and while it only needs to be loosened to remove the other bolt, I'm gonna go ahead and take it all the way out. 1, so we can clean up the bolt, and 2, so we can put some Loctite on it when it goes back in. All right, so we got that out of the way. Next step here is gonna be to get in here with a T50, I believe this is, T47, and take this big lower mount bolt out. So go ahead and get that started. All right, that one was pretty good and tight. Wasn't using a very long ratchet, I suppose. All right, and that should be clear to come out. Right, so there's our lower mount bolt. And obviously you can see that the bike didn't fall or move at all, and that was because we had the jack set at the right height, so there was no upward or downward pressure on this bolt from the shock. All right, so I'm gonna go over to the other side and take the top bolt out now. All right, so over on this side, I'm gonna use the impact gun with a 1/2-inch socket on it to do this bolt. I said the last time I did a video about one of these that these bolts are typically very tight and can sometimes take a little bit of doing to get them out. And then on that bike, the thing literally just blew right out. So let's see what happens this time, see if I got another weirdly easy one, or if this one shows you what I was talking about the last time about how these can fight you a little bit coming out. So I guess let's just give it a shot. It was a little tighter than the last one. Certainly if you were trying to do that by hand, that might have been a little difficult, but obviously no big deal for the impact gun. All right, so there's your top bolt. So with both those bolts removed, we should be able to just pull the shock up and out. All right, so these sort of random wires the customers got running here, I just sort of pulled them up and over here so they're not in our way anymore. And so now we can just pick up the shock and slide it out. So there's our old one, it's going in the takeoff box. We're gonna clean all the dirt and grime and crap out of here, and we will get started with installing the new shock right away. Okay, so went ahead and got this area cleaned up. I also dealt with all that mess of wires and stuff that was under here. So what that was a sort of universal Bluetooth speaker amplifier, I don't know what, some junk that the owner of the bike actually didn't even know was there and is not using. So I had the distinct privilege of pulling it all out and throwing it in the trash. So we got all that stuff out of there. They also, to fit that in, did something with the battery hold down, a lot of weird stuff going on under there. But anyway, it's all fixed and back to the way it should be now. And we're ready to go ahead and get this shock put in now. I talked a little bit about the product. Let's just show you a little bit before it goes in. So obviously we got a remote reservoir here, and this is gonna be your rebound adjustment. And then you've got your collar here that's gonna put preload on the spring as you thread it up and down the shaft of the shock body. So pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. So the way this is gonna go into the bike is with the reservoir hose side facing towards the rear of the bike. It's gonna slide in here, the reservoir hose will run down along the swing arm, and then we mount the reservoir onto the swing arm as well. Now, I don't know if you can see from the angle there, but obviously we've got a ways to jack this bike up to get this shock put on, so before it's even gonna fit in. So before I do that, we just got a couple of zip ties holding these bushings in here. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these cut off, and we'll start to raise the bike up. We'll get the shock fitted into place, and we'll start to get it bolted in. All right, got our zip ties cut off and got the bike jacked up a little bit more. So what I'm gonna do is just lay this into place. Get it up in the top, in the bottom. I'm just gonna let it sit right there for a second. And I got just a microfiber here, just wrap the reservoir with so it doesn't get scratched or dinged up or anything like that. And we've got our upper shock mount bolt here. This is gonna go in from the other side. I've got some blue Loctite on there. So let me walk around and do that. So we'll just line it up, throw the bolt in, and we'll get it started. And then I'm gonna run this in and torque it down to 90 foot-pounds. All right, so with the top connected, we can now work on the bottom or back, whatever your preference. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna look through and make sure we've got the swing arm lined up perfectly around the shock eyelet so that we can get this put on. Okay, that looks pretty good, right about there. And we're gonna start with the bolt. Now, this one technically does not need Loctite on it because it's got a pinch around it, but I like to put a little bit on just to be safe. So, get that in. Okay, snug that down. And then we're going to torque this one to 75 foot-pounds. All right. Now, I've got one last little piece here, which is to get the set screw put back in. All right, so put a little bit of Loctite on the pinch bolt here. Get this started. All right, and I'm gonna torque this to 14 foot-pounds. Okay. So there's our shock installed. Now, before I go ahead and move on to the reservoir, I'm just gonna go ahead and put the cross member back in because no reason not to do that right now. Just gotta find where I put it. There we go. All right, so this just sets right here. And get this back in place. Our two larger bolts, and then the small additional screw as well. All right, so it's worth pointing out here, just as I put this on, obviously you've got your preload adjuster here. This is probably easier to access if you have the cross member out. However, I don't have the customer here to do the final setting on the preload. We've got it adjusted about where I think it's probably gonna be, but we're gonna have the rider sit on it to do that. And I just wanted to show you this all going back together. So if we need to take this off again in order to adjust the preload, we'll do that. But at the moment, we've got access to it, so we should be able to do it no problem with this brace in place. But if you were doing this yourself on your own bike, you might want to just stop, do the preload adjustment with the fender and seat and obviously all that on, and then go ahead and do this very last. So just a little call out there. All right, so from here, what we're gonna do is go ahead and look at getting the reservoir mounted onto the swing arm. I'll bring the camera over here and have you take a look. All right, so over here on the left side of the bike, this is sort of where I left the reservoir, just kind of show you where I had it tucked away. This is real simple. We're gonna go ahead and bolt this onto using the clamp that comes with it. We're gonna bolt it onto the mount that's welded onto the swing arm that was for the belt guard. Now, obviously this bike has been converted to a chain already, which is why the belt guard has already been removed. If you're running a bike that still has a belt on it, you can do that, no problem. You're just gonna have to take the belt guard off, which of course is no big deal, and you'll be left in this exact situation. So just fish this out of here, take this cover off, and I'm gonna go ahead and slide the bracket on, and we are gonna bolt this right like that. So we've got this bolt, we're gonna slide through, it's gonna come through the bracket, and then we've got a nylock nut that is going to go on the other side here. Don't drop it. All right, so I'm gonna get that started, and then I'm just gonna look at getting this positioned so that it's nice and straight, even, level, all that good stuff. So you don't wanna over tighten this, you know, you're just trying to get it so that it's nice and snug and not gonna go anywhere, and it's gonna hold everything in place, and just make sure the lines are all right and you've got it kind of running in a way that looks good to you. All right, and that looks good. Got our adjuster working properly. Everything's nice and snug. Not going anywhere, not in the way of our chain. Sitting nice and parallel to the swing arm, and we're good to go. So it is at this point that we would more or less be done if this was anything but a street bob, but because it's a street bob, as I mentioned, we've got to clearance the fender on the inside to make room for this line. So hopefully this is a little bit more obvious now, what I was talking about in terms of what we're trying to clearance for. So I've got our fender in the workshop, or in the workbench, ready to start modifying that. So I'll bring the camera in there, show you what I'm gonna do, and we'll get this bike wrapped up. Okay, so here's our fender, obviously, and I've got some tape on here to protect the edges, and I've drawn a little black line where I plan to make the cut. Obviously, we'll do a little testing to make sure it's gonna clear. If this isn't enough, we'll take a little bit more off, but I think this should be pretty good based on the little diagram that RWD provides. I've only done on a street bob one of these before. Typically, like I said, most of the time we don't have to do this, so if I don't get it on the first time, we'll take a little more off, but hopefully we can get enough off on the first pass. Let me just pick this up, let you see a little closer what that looks like. Just taking a little bit off, and obviously that's not gonna be visible from the outside of the bike, what we're cutting. So I'm not really gonna be able to show you all doing this just because These Street Bob fenders with this license plate hanging off, it means I can't turn the fender around the other way. I have to leave this edge sort of hanging off the workbench. So I'm gonna need to go to a different spot where I'll be able to get at this from the other side, but I don't have room to put the camera there. So I'm gonna start doing this and I'll kind of show you the progress and we'll see how it fits onto the bike. Okay, so this might be a little bit difficult to see, so I just picked up the camera here, but you can see where we took that initial cut into the green tape there to clearance the fender on that one side. And the idea here being is obviously we have the bike fully jacked up. I suppose the thought is that this fitting, obviously because it's pivoting with the swing arm, will come forward under the compression of the shock when you full down travel on the bike, so the shock compresses, that this would come forward. So I think we've got it clear enough now so that this is above that. I know it's really hard to see, but hopefully you get the idea of what we're trying to accomplish there. So I think this should work. I'm gonna go ahead and kind of put this together. I'm gonna bolt the fender in. I'm gonna temporarily put the seat on, and I'm gonna try and put some weight on it and see how it looks when it compresses. But if it's good, I'm gonna go ahead and take the fender assembly back off and throw some paint on the raw metal that we just created, let it dry, and then we'll get back to finalizing this install. Okay, little cut in here. I was just editing the footage and putting this video together and realized that I never took a shot of the final product of the fender with the trimming and everything complete back on the bike. So I figured I'd come back and just show you that after the fact. So hopefully you can see here where we trimmed that fender. Tried to make it, like I said, as clean as we possibly could. You can see a little bit of the paint that we put on there that kind of came over the edge a little bit. I figured better safe than sorry there to make sure we had full coverage. So I think it looks really clean. I think you probably wouldn't even notice if you weren't looking at it. So after we cut it, we obviously filed it and sanded those edges and deburred it before we painted it. So hopefully that all makes sense to you. And this is just kind of what it looks like here, fully installed. And obviously, I kind of hinted at this before. It might not look like you needed to make that trim because this line and this fitting is all the way back here under the fender. But when the bike compresses, that fitting moves forward, and that's where you might have the issue of it hitting the fender. So that's why they're instructing you to make that trim there. So hopefully that's clear, and hopefully that makes sense. And well, now back to the rest of the install. All right, so got our fender back on, final installed. I didn't show tightening these bolts down, but hopefully you can figure out putting 4 bolts in, 2 on each side. Obviously you can see here now that we've got quite a bit more lift going on. So the jack is no longer holding the bike up. This is its final height. And well, obviously you got a pretty good gap there. So I'm gonna take the tape measure here. So I'm gonna measure this now. We still have one more step to do before we're done, but I'm gonna measure this now before I move this nut and get it out of position, just so we can get an accurate sort of apples to apples comparison. So I'm gonna do this. And we are at 12.5 inches, which is exactly 2 inches more than where we were before, which is pretty much what we expected to have happen here with this kit. So that's pretty cool. I think customers gonna be really stoked about this. And obviously, if anyone's looking for one of these shocks for an M8 Softail, we've got them on the shelf, so just hit us up. They're on our website, ironanchorcycles.com, link in the description below. I'm gonna go ahead and do the retensioning on the chain now. This would be more or less the same procedure for a belt. I'm gonna go ahead and do that on camera just so that you can see the full thing from start to finish. And we'll get the seat put on here. We'll get this bike put on the ground too, so you can kind of see what it looks like in its actual sort of living position. So you meet me on the other side of the bike and we'll go ahead and get this chain readjusted. All right, so maybe this goes without saying and maybe it doesn't, but when you put a taller shock or shocks on a bagger or a Dyna on your motorcycle, you are going to have to reset your belt or chain tension. And the reason for that is because you've changed the geometry of where the rear axle is located in relation to your output shaft and your transmission. So what's happened, and perhaps it's a little bit difficult to see, but hopefully it's evident by the fact that your chain or belt is gonna get looser, not tighter when you do this. You've moved this closer, and closer has to do with the angle, right? So it used to be sort of down here and it was a longer path that comes up here. It's a shorter path, right? Doesn't really matter. Bottom line is, if you drop your bike, you're gonna have to loosen your belt or chain. If you raise it, you're gonna have to tension it. Fairly obvious that that's the case here. So what we're gonna do just to get started is I'm gonna go ahead and pick the bike up and get the weight off the rear tire again. All right, and now I'm gonna go to the other side and just loosen, not remove, just loosen the axle nut. All right, so as I do this, it doesn't need to be loose. So typically what I do is loosen it up pretty good, and then I just put a little bit of basically hand tight kind of tension on it. It's not so tight that the axle won't be able to move, but the axle adjusters will still be able to push the axle back, which is what we're gonna do. So if you were certain that your axle was straight, you would simply move your adjusters the same on each side to move the axle straight back. We try not to take anything for granted here, not assume anything, particularly because who knows who the last person to work on this was or whatever. So we're gonna check to make sure that the axle is straight now, and if it's not, we're gonna straighten it and then move it evenly back. So we've got our little alignment tool here, and I'm gonna compare this on both sides and see where we're at. All right, so we're not quite straight. So the axle is a little bit off center, which is no big deal. We're gonna fix it right now. So it looks like, obviously, because I wanna move the axle back, I'm gonna take the side that's further forward and push it back and see what that does to our tension, and then we'll go from there. So it looks like it is this side that needs to come back a little bit in order to line up with the other side. So I'm gonna move, turn this side back. All right, that's pretty close. I'm gonna recheck it. I'm gonna not do this all on camera because I'm gonna keep going back and forth here, but I'm gonna check back in once I get it straightened out and even, and I'll show you how we finish it up. Okay, so it wasn't actually very far off at all. It was maybe about, I don't know, half a turn or so on one side. So very, very close. It might have been adjusted correctly and, you know, loosened up or moved a little bit. Anything's possible, but in any event, we're even now, and we've still got a lot of slack here. So what I'm gonna do is find the wrench, and we are going to adjust this nut now, bolt, evenly on each side to move the axle back a little bit further. So what I'm gonna start by doing is I'm gonna kind of go it's a little hard. You can't really make half turns or anything like that because of the swing arm on these bikes. So what I'm gonna do is go as close to a full travel from top to bottom as I can on both sides. So there's one on that side. There's one on that side. So taking out quite a bit of slack just with that little bit. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tighten the axle back down, and we're gonna put the bike back down and take a look at the chain tension. All right, so the axle's tight but not torqued, and we're gonna come down. All right, and that for a chain actually feels pretty perfect. So this is obviously different for a belt and a chain. For a belt, you're gonna go by the factory spec. You can use a belt tension gauge to check the 10 pounds of pressure you put on it. With a chain, you really have to do it more by eye and by feel. There is, the correct sort of amount of play in a chain, which you want. The belt is gonna be a spec, the chain's gonna be a little different, like I said. So anyway, the only other thing I wanna do here is I'm gonna rotate this rear wheel a little bit, and I'm gonna see if we've got any kind of like tight spots or loose spots, see if there's anything we have to adjust for. What we wanna make sure of on a chain, I guess I'll just kind of spell it out while we're doing this, is you don't want, when this bike sags down when you're sitting on it, you don't want that chain to get so tight that it's under tension. So you don't want it so loose that it's gonna be sort of slopping around and flapping when it's not, but you have to find that sweet spot, and that can take a couple of tries if you haven't done it before. So in any event, I'm looking to see if we've got roughly the same amount of play all the way around. You're gonna have a tight spot. That's just how a chain is. And what you wanna do is just make sure that in that tight spot, you're not gonna be too tight. That might be the tightest spot right there. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna bring this down. So that seems like it's pretty good to me. I'm gonna check it with weight on the bike just to triple check it, but in terms of the procedure, that's how it goes. So the last step here would be to just torque down the axle. So I'll take care of that. We'll get this bike wiped down, get the seat back on, and we'll take a look at the final product. All right, so there it is. RWD, RS-1 Monoshock, all installed, all buttoned up, back on the ground, ready to go. So I think you get a much better sense of the stance of the bike when it's back on the ground. It's a little bit awkward sort of looking at it horizontally. It looks maybe a little, not quite as good as it does when it's sitting on the ground. I think it looks awesome now that it's back down here. So these shocks have an incredible amount of travel. They ride really well, raise the bike up. It's all good as far as I can tell. When you get on, and again, the preload hasn't been set on this, and obviously the customer doesn't necessarily weigh what I do, but you get a good amount of travel in this shock, and probably if this was me, this might be a little bit too much sag, but I don't know, maybe that's about an inch. Hard to say. But in any event, I think we're gonna go take this bike for a test ride and get it picked up.